So today, we're going to challenge your ability to multitask. If you didn't notice, Stacy's over here doing some pottery. So I know that you're going to be watching her and watching me, and you're going to get confused. But I know you can look at your phone and watch TV at the same time. So you can do both of these. All right. So as I speak, I hope you can listen to me. And she doesn't like being the center of attention anyway, so she would rather you look at me. All right. And so we're gonna start a series today about the church. And when I talk about the church, I'm not talking about the building here at the corner of Post and Dancy. I'm talking about the Church Universal. And what I mean by Church Universal is every person on the planet who is a follower of Jesus Christ. That's the Church Universal. And so we're going to look at, as we go through this series, what is the church supposed to be? What was God's design for it? What have we done well? What do we need to improve on? And what is ahead? What needs to happen for the church to fulfill its full potential in God's plan and for His glory? So we're gonna go through that, and we're going to talk about that. And so we're going to start a very odd place in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. A long time before the church ever came into being, God made a covenant, an agreement with Abraham. It's Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. It's page 11 if you're using the Pew Bible. Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. So, God came to Abraham, and this is what happened. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." All right, so now I'm going to say something that may be confusing or controversial to you, but let me explain. And if you still disagree with it, that's fine. But in theology, we talk about this idea that the church is the center point of everything. All right? It's called the centrality of the church. So in other words, that from the beginning of, before the beginning of time, through current day, the whole purpose of history from God's point of view was the establishment of the Church Universal. All right? Hold on with me. I'll explain all of that. So clearly, in the promise that He made to Abraham in verse 3, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you." Now, the apostles and the writers of the New Testament and on through history, clearly it is believed that that promise came through Jesus of Nazareth. Right? That Jesus came and lived a perfect life. He died on the cross. He was buried and came back to life so that all the peoples of the world could be blessed through what He did as a descendant of Abraham. Okay? And so that is believed to be the promise. Now, the other side of this is we have to ask this question: why did God create humans? Why did God put us here on the earth? And I think, and so we could have a long discussion about that. But I'm going to suggest there's two reasons that God put us here. The first reason was to have a love relationship with us. That He could love us and we could love Him. And the second reason is so that we could connect to other people. And what I mean by that is God put inside each one of us a desire to know and be known. Now, some people want to be known by thousands, and some people want to be known by one or two. But there is this desire for us, inside of us, to be connected to other people. And so God made us, I believe the Scripture's pretty open about this, to love us and so that we could connect to others. And the place where that happens is the church. The place where those two things come together is the Church Universal. You know, we're more connected to non-believers in the Middle East than we are non-believers in the States? Would you process that for a second? Because we're going to be eternal brothers and sisters. And so the centrality of the church, the idea is that everything that God did and designed was for the church to come into existence. And the reason the church is in existence is to accomplish those things, but to uplift and honor King Jesus. That's why we're here. All right? And so we are guardians of the message of Christ. We are the ones who live out this Jesus life so that people can see it. We are the center point of history, the centrality of the church universal. All right? So you're going to hear me say this a couple of times today, maybe 3 or 4 times. We don't come to church. This building is not the church. We're the church. You and I, wherever we go, we represent King Jesus as the body of Christ, as the bride of Christ, as the church. Okay? So keep all of that in mind, the centrality of the church. And now we're gonna have a little history lesson, so hang in there with me, but I think it's very important. So, when God, before the beginning of time, looked at the church, he had a design. And we're going to let this pot that Stacy made just a little while ago represent God's picture of what he wanted the church to be. All right, so he had this idea of this is what I want the church to accomplish. And so we get a picture of what he wanted in Acts 2, 42 through 47. We do that every January. We're not going to do it today. But there was this picture of a connection, of a fellowship, of a love for each other, of a love for Christ, of a willingness to tell people about Christ. And this beautiful picture of harmony and unity in pursuit of God's dream and God's vision for what the church was. And that's what he pictured, and that's what he wanted to happen, and that's what he wanted it to be. And so we see in Acts 2, 42 through 47, we see that picture come about. But in fact, historically, got a ways to go? Okay, that's fine. So she's going to make another one that's going to be similar to this. All right? So historically, the church was pretty close for the first 300 years of the church. For the first 300 years, we got it right. For the first 300 years, it wasn't perfect. And in fact, when she's done and we put the new pot up here, they're going to look very, very similar, but they're not going to be identical. Okay? And so for the first 300 years, they did a great job of being the church that God designed. Again, it wasn't perfect. There were times of difficulty as far as theology. There was Gnosticism. There was a belief that had to be corrected. There were other things that were taking place that they had to fix, and they had some difficulties. But all in all, it never stopped being about King Jesus for the first 300 years. And there were things in history that were going on that made that possible. First of all, for those first 300 years, Christianity was illegal. They didn't meet in buildings. They met in catacombs. They met in people's homes, and nobody else knew about it. They were not allowed to worship publicly. It was against the law. But yet they continued to worship. There was no paid clergy. There were no bishops. There were no pastors who were paid. There were no great cathedrals that people met in. There were just people. And the irony is during those first 300 years, there was this phenomenal reality that took place. The Christian movement spread throughout the world. It was phenomenal. We know Paul's story, Paul and Silas and Barnabas and Timothy. They went to Eastern Europe and established churches all over Eastern Europe. And we're here today because they did that. But we don't talk about John Mark, who once was rejected by Paul, who went to Egypt and founded the church in Alexandria, which became known as the Coptic Church, a church that still exists today. And John Mark went and established this church. You may remember a story in the last few years about some Coptic Christians being beheaded because of their faith. They started right after Jesus ascended. We don't talk about the story of Thomas. Thomas went to India, and he took the gospel to India. And today there are millions of people who live in India who call themselves Thomas Christians because Thomas went there and told them about Jesus. And what's fascinating about that first group and the first 300 years, it was illegal to be a Christian, but you know what? They had two things, and they're two things that you and I still have. They had the story of Jesus, and they had the Holy Spirit. That's it. That's what they had. You and I have the same thing. So for those first 300 years, this movement of Jesus was so powerful and it accomplished so many things, and so many lives were transformed that the church really was the center point of the thinking, because King Jesus was who it was all about. So the church survived and thrived because it was all about our King. And so the church did its best to keep the original picture that God had in mind, to keep the original design, to make it exactly what God wanted it to be, and for the longest time, they did. We have stories in the 100s where plagues would come and people would be dying by the thousands, and nobody knew what the plague was. The doctors were terrified, and they would leave because they didn't want to catch it. And the stories are of Christians staying and trying to nurse people back to health. Some of them would die, but then they would nurse others back to health. And they would sacrifice themselves or sacrifice whatever they risked to help people make it through. So they lived out this life of faith. They lived out this life of the church. And they did. You got it? And so we have the basic design that is similar, and so the church said, you know what? We like God's idea, and we're going to do the best we can to keep it the same. So you'll come and you'll see differences. This one's a little smaller, and I have stuff all over my hands, and all right? But the same idea. They tried to maintain what the church was supposed to be in God's design. Then something happened. Something that totally changed the trajectory of the church. Something that made it go a completely different direction. You see, it was illegal until 313 to be a Christian and for the church to worship. 313, in what's called the Edict of Milan. I know you'll remember that. But Emperor Constantine passed a decree that for the first time in history, Christians could worship openly. And all throughout the Roman Empire, Christians began to worship. And can you imagine the joy that they had? We've been hiding out for so long. We've been in the catacombs and in people's homes, and our friends are being killed for the faith. And now for the first time, we get to do what we've always done openly. And at the start, it was really a cool thing. It was a fantastic beginning. But something really bad happened, and nobody could have imagined what would take place. Because the emperor himself, Constantine, claimed to be a follower of Jesus as well. It became very advantageous for the people to follow Christ too. And so all of a sudden, people came to the church in droves, and the whole attitude changed. So instead of trying to live out God's design for the church decided, you know what? We have a better design, God. We like yours, and it's good, and it's gone well for a few hundred years, but you know what? I think we can make it better. We can take what you designed, and we can add to it, and we can build incredibly huge cathedrals, which are absolutely gorgeous, if you've ever been to one. And they're absolutely empty, too. But these big, beautiful cathedrals, and what happened historically is that the church ruled not only the church, but it also ruled the world. And so just as a side note, that historically, when religion rules the world, it's never good. People die. Doesn't matter if it's Christianity or Islam or even Buddhism. When religion rules, people die. And that's what happened to Christianity. You know the stories, I'm sure, of the Inquisition, the stories of the Crusades, and holy wars in the name of Jesus. Where does that come from? So the church said, you know what, God, you have a good plan, but we can make it better. And what happened is that this following of Jesus, the church stopped being a movement and started being an institution. So theology changed to the point that the way you're right with God is by being right with the church. And so all of a sudden, the church has this incredible power. And so people come to the church, and the literacy is so off the charts that they just trust the church and whatever it says. And so this new design for church comes. And all of a sudden, church is about humans instead of about King Jesus. 1517, the Reformation began under Martin Luther, trying to rediscover this original design, but had difficulty getting rid of some of the things, or the vestiges, if you will, the traditions that went along with the church, and they kept those, and they kept trying to come back to the original picture. And they made moves towards that, and the church began to recover some of the things that it lost, but still wasn't God's design. Then, they brought the church to America. And you know what happened in America? They took the church and they added capitalism to it. Boy, and then it really became a mess. And so what happened then in the church here in America, and I'm not attacking the country, that's not what this is about. I'm talking about church. What happened is it all of a sudden became about consumerism. I'll go to the place that meets my needs the most. And somewhere in there, we never lost the idea that God lived in a building. And so we come to church to meet with God, because as soon as we leave, He sits here and twiddles His thumb waiting for us to come back. See, that's what happened. And so all of a sudden, the church, instead of being about King Jesus, is about us. Well, that's a problem. Because all of a sudden, it doesn't really matter what King Jesus thinks. And this is hard stuff to hear, but it's stuff we've got to hear. When what we do stops being about the King, and we just need to quit doing it. We just need to quit. So the church had this great idea. I don't think the intentions were wrong, but what ended up happening is people mattered more than the King. We as Christians mattered more than the King. And so if you go back in history and you see when the church started this massive expansion under Constantine and after him, what you have is you have a lot of people who are Christian in name only. And that's carried over as well. So here's what I want to challenge us with today. God's pretty smart. He knows the best picture of church. He knows what it's supposed to look like. And it's amazing that He didn't get a committee of us together to figure out what was best. Right? He just said, this is what's best. This is what you need to do. This is who you need to be. So, I have a slide that I want to show you, and this is a book the elders we read a few years ago. It's called The Kingdom Matrix. But in the book, he talks about brand expanders versus kingdom expanders. And what's happened in the church is that many times we become brand expanders. So I'm going to explain this to you, and this has been real helpful for me. And he wrote what has been on my mind for so many years in a perfect way, or in a very good way. So brand expanders are those who are more concerned about what the church looks like as far as the building and the people in it, etc., and they're more focused on religious consumerism. What can I do? What can I perform? What can I make happen to make sure that the most people are here? Right? And so we see that happen, and I'm not attacking mega churches. I'm really not. There's some that do some fantastic things. But when the church is driven by what makes people happy, the church moves further and further away from the King. Right? The second thing that he talked about in brand expanders is competition. So instead of it being about the kingdom and the kingdom expanding, I become really concerned about what all the other churches are doing and how they're doing. So I want to beat them and be better than them. What is that? That's American capitalism. It's competition. The third thing is group isolation. So what happens is eventually over time is you become a closed group. Oh, that's very nice. It is pretty. Thank you. All right. So, group isolation. So the idea is it becomes us against everybody who's not one of us. We are the believers, so we huddle up and we can't let anybody else in because they might just mess us up or they might make us unholy all of a sudden, as if we're holy on our own. The next one is conforming. So again, it is conforming to culture. It is conforming to whatever's going to make people happy. And then the last one on this side, I think, is the last one on this side, is a corporate identity. So what we want is we are more concerned about being a part of the church at Post and Dancy than we are about the kingdom of God. All right, is there one more? All right. And then orthodoxy and not having orthopraxy. Those are big words for orthodoxy is what you believe. So many times what happens in this brand expander is we're more concerned about what we believe than what we live. Right? As long as you believe the right thing, it's okay. It doesn't matter what you live, just believe the right stuff. Right? There's a lot of that going on in the American church today. Well, then he talks about what he calls the kingdom expanders. The kingdom expanders. There we go. All right? So the thing that the kingdom expanders believe, first of all, is it's not about religious consumerism. It's about sacrificial giving away. You know what the first church did, what they had to do if they were going to follow Jesus? They had to say, I am willing to die for this. I'm willing to be thrown in prison for this. I'm willing to lose my family for this. I'm willing to give God whatever it requires of me. Right? The difference in that and consumerism is phenomenal. Right? Because it's about him, not about me. The second thing is his presence. It's not about a competition. It's about being in his presence and having him and glorifying him and coming together to lift him up, not to lift ourselves up, to lift him up. The next one is an interdependence. So instead of isolating ourselves, we realize that the community needs us, so we connect outside the walls, we connect to them, and we always have an open space for somebody new. Always. Because everybody needs the king. All right, the next one, the incarnation. We live for Christ. We remember that we don't come to church, that we are the church. And so today when you leave this building and you go to a restaurant and you're mean to the waiter or the waitress, you're misrepresenting the king. Because you're the church while you're sitting in that restaurant. So if you're going to do that, tell them you're Presbyterian. Whatever. Right? I'm joking. All right? So, but wherever we go, whether it's work tomorrow, whether it's school tomorrow, wherever we are the church. Right? It's not brick and mortar that's the church. We're the church. And we take the church with us. That is just so huge. And so we live as the church in a world that doesn't accept Jesus. That's okay. In the world, but not of it, like we talked about last week. Right? All right, the next one, the incarnation, is we live for the king. We don't live for the brand name. It's all about the king. Everything we do. It's about uplifting and honoring him. And then the last one is you not only believe the right thing, but you practice the right thing. And that's so key. So, hear me when I say, centrality of the church is something that is true for history. But it should be for us too. It should be for us too. Because the church exists to honor the king. And as followers of Jesus, we're all a part of this thing we call the church. God had a good plan for it. And we need to strive to become that plan again. And that's what it's all about. So I want to show you, we have our new shirts, and they say the same thing as the old shirts, but the back is really a big deal because it's one of our mottos. It's not about us. It's about the king. We don't do what we do so that people will be impressed. We don't do what we do so that we'll get accolades and praise. We do what we do so people will be pointed to the king. That's what it's about. And when the church loses that, the church stops being the church, and it becomes a club. It becomes a club. We don't want to be a club. We want to represent our King here in this neighborhood and in this world. All right? Pray with me.